I'm coming down to the floor to speak for a few minutes on the bill that we're debating now to provide some structure of congressional oversight over a potential, though not yet signed, deal with Iran. So I just want to start simply with what we all agree on here. We all agree that we need to do whatever we can to ensure that Iran never obtains a nuclear weapon. I have no doubt that 100 members of the United States Senate would agree to that proposition. That's our guiding principle. It should be our North Star. We may disagree on the best way to achieve a nuclear weapons-free Iran, but we can all agree on our goal. So how do we get there is the question that we're debating. I happen to be a member of the camp that believes that our best hope of achieving this goal is through diplomacy, through a negotiated settlement that dramatically rolls back Iran's nuclear program in a transparent and verifiable way. And while our negotiations still have a long way to go to get to that agreement, we're closer now than we've been in decades. I and many of my colleagues strongly believe that we should give our negotiators the space to do their jobs and to see if a deal is ultimately possible. And that's really what this bill does. It postpones a congressional vote on these negotiations appropriately until the negotiations are finished. That makes sense, right? There's no use on voting on a deal when we don't have a deal. And then it sets up time constraints for Congress's review of that potential deal, basically about 30 days. That's a reasonable period of time for us to debate the agreement. And if there is one, it gives some certainty over our process to those that are at the negotiating table. The president's critics seem to fall into two often overlapping camps. One strain of argument holds that this framework agreement that we have right now is just too weak, and that our side should walk away from the table, reimpose sanctions, and hold out for a better deal. The second strain of argument, evidenced frankly by many of the amendments that have been filed to the underlying bill, holds that our negotiation shouldn't be just about Iran's nuclear program, that we should also be negotiating over all of the other bad things that Iran does and supports. Now, I don't think it's worth getting into a defense of the framework today, since we're months away from a final deal. But to my mind, if the final deal does look demonstrably like the framework, we would be fools to reject it. Does it allow Iran to do nuclear research? Yes, it does. Does it allow them to keep some centrifuges? Yes. But anybody who thought that we were going to sign a deal that would effectively be an unconditional surrender was living in a fantasy land. The framework accomplishes our goal of protecting Israel, the region, and the United States from a quick nuclear breakout. The plutonium pathway at Iraq is ended. The enriched stores basically go down to zero. Fordow and Natanz, they stay open, but they no longer can do substantial enrichment, and they're going to have international scientists and inspectors crawling all over their capacities. And inspections on the entire nuclear supply chain will be at a scale that is really totally, completely unprecedented in the history of the nuclear age. It's a good framework. But even if you don't believe this, I just think it belies common sense to think that walking away from the table now would get you a better deal. Yes, we could reinstitute sanctions, the United States could, and perhaps some of our partners would go along, but they'd be weaker than before because lots of countries who think this is a good framework wouldn't go along with this. Just look at what Russia and China have announced in the past few weeks. They basically have telegraphed that they're looking to do business with the Iranians, notwithstanding what happens at the negotiating table. And we know what happens when we apply weak sanctions against Iran alongside a policy of isolating them. They get stronger. How do we know this? Because in 2002, we had a chance to cap Iran's centrifuges at a few hundred. Instead, after years of relatively weak sanctions and international isolation, Iran built 20,000 centrifuges and put in place a secret nuclear facility. Now, our most recent round of tough international sanctions, in part because of the policies of this Congress, worked to get to the table, the negotiating table, but only because there was a credible offer of a negotiated solution. We know exactly what happens what sanctions and isolation get us because we tried it for years. It gets us 20,000 centrifuges, no international inspections, and an increasingly hardline and inward-looking regime. And this last point and result is important because the people of Iran actually don't think like their supreme leader. His grasp on power isn't absolute, in large part because Iranians are much more moderate, much more internationalist, and much more pro-American than their leader, generally. Khomeini knows this, and that's why when Iranian voters elected a moderate, Western-oriented president, the supreme leader allowed his team the space to negotiate this framework. Now, no one can be certain, but it is certainly plausible to believe that moderate forces inside Iran are winning, and that our policy toward Iran should consider whether our actions help the moderates or help the hardliners. We don't want another hardline administration, but we're going to get one if we walk away from these negotiations now, when thousands of Iranians are cheering the opening of relations with the West. If we walk away, moderate voters are going to feel abandoned. Hardliners will be proven right. The two groups will be merged. Politics inside Iran will shift inward and extreme again. And for all of my Republican colleagues who were so forceful in their criticism of the administration, saying that President Obama didn't do enough to support the Green Revolution, you do far more damage to this cause by ending reformers' hopes of rapprochement with the West right now. Now, for the second argument, Madam President, that we should settle all of our grievances with Iran in one fell swoop right now. That this agreement is somehow illegitimate unless Iran renounces Hamas and Hezbollah, unless they get right with Israel, unless they end their other non-nuclear weapons programs, unless they release political prisoners, and so on, and so on. Now, first, there's not a single person here who agrees or supports Iran's support for terrorism or its inflammatory rhetoric towards Israel. No one is pleased with the Iranian regime's record on human rights or its funding of Hezbollah. But let's agree that in Iran that pursues these policies and has a nuclear weapon is a far worse outcome, one that should be avoided at all costs. The truth is that adding these issues into the nuclear agreement will mean that no deal is possible. And America, we're strong enough to be able to walk and chew gum at the same time. We can negotiate with an enemy or an adversary on one issue and reserve the right to fight another day or simultaneously on other issues. For evidence of this, I'd ask my Republican friends to simply look to their great romanticized hero, President Ronald Reagan. When he was negotiating a nuclear weapons deal with the Soviet Union, he did not simultaneously try to address the USSR's support for proxies in Central America or the Middle East or their provocative naval activities in the Pacific Ocean. He knew that by taking one issue off the table, it would make America and the world safer, even if it didn't address all of our grievances at once. And he knew that if he did put everything on the table all at once, then there'd be no progress. Just like a little kid can't eat a hot dog all in one bite, no matter how hard he tries, we all have to make progress, one bite at a time. That's often just how life and, in fact, how negotiations tend to work. So I hope that my colleagues will oppose these well-meaning amendments that are being offered. They have laudable goals, but in the real world, they are simply unrealistic within the confines of these negotiations, and they'll have the effect of killing the deal entirely. And on a broader scale, I hope when this debate is done, Madam President, that we can also ask ourselves some bigger questions. Diplomacy is power. It's not weakness. Talking to your enemies has been part of our national security toolbox for as long as we have existed as a nation. This country is tired, it's weary of war, for good reason. 10 years of conflict in Iraq didn't make us any safer, and a lot of people, heroes, died in the process. But when we spend all of this time, the majority of this Congress, engaged in detailed oversight over the president's diplomatic endeavors, and absolutely no time engaged in detailed oversight over a war in Iraq and Syria that is still, months and months later, unauthorized and extra-constitutional, then we send a bad message to America and to the rest of the world. We seem to have a developing double standard when it comes to oversight. We're all over the president when he talks to our adversaries, but we stand down when he fights them. Lots of oversight over peace, very little over war. That's not where the American people are. They want their president to take extraordinary steps to avoid war. They don't want us to get dragged back into a ground war in the Middle East. Now, Madam President, I'm supporting this bill today because I'll be first in line to reassert Congress's power to set foreign policy right alongside the president. But I don't support Congress sending a message that diplomacy is somehow more worthy of rigorous oversight than military action. I don't think this is where the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee is coming from, but there are certainly some members of his caucus who simply view American power solely through a military lens. That's dangerous because, as we saw in Iraq, large-scale military operations, they kill a lot of terrorists, a lot of bad guys, but they often create two for everyone they kill. In the end, it's non-kinetic intervention that solves extremism, building inclusive governments, lifting people out of destitution and poverty, countering radical propaganda, and showing an America that backs up all of its talk about human rights and civil liberties with action. I'm so thankful to Chairman Corker for taking the time to work on this bill with Senator Cardin and Senator Menendez and others to make it something that we can truly rally around today. That takes guts, to show patience, to give ground, to talk to people that you don't agree with. It's actually diplomacy that wins the day here more often than not. It's our guiding value as a body, as an institution. It's what makes this place work when it works. And we are best when we recognize that the value of diplomacy and the results that we get from it doesn't expire at the edges of this chamber.